Is everything you get in CPD sessions worth listening to and worth adopting? We're going to talk about it. And Kat is back. Kat, thank you so much for joining me again today. You are more than welcome at the Chalk Face.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad that I didn't, make the numbers dive too much last week.
Oh,
To ask me
subscriptions are
back.
down, views are down.
My plan is working, everyone.
No, that's not true. That's not true. Thank you so much for joining me again. I'm really, really grateful for your time and your opinion. And we're never short of an opinion at the Chalk Face. So, at least 5 times a year, teachers get CPD sessions, inset days. And no doubt that will happen at the beginning of this academic year as well, as you get a day. Most schools get a day before the students actually come back, where you look at results and you think about the new school initiative, the thing that you are going to do this year that you haven't done before, and teachers haven't had any time to prepare for it. But nonetheless, it is imposed and you are expected to deliver it. So I know, Kat, you've got some thoughts about this, and this is how I'm going to lay it out to you. You said to me, do you know, sometimes in teaching, there's feelings over research. What are you on about?
Absolutely. I feel very strongly that if we're meant to be in a in an era where research-backed pedagogy is king, then why do we spend most of our time going with, oh, this is a new shiny thing, let's run after that. This feels right. I've been doing this for 20 years. Of course I'll keep doing it. It seems to work for me. It's all a bunch of nonsense. We should be validating our thoughts and feelings with actual research and actual data. And I'll give you the number one thing that drives me absolutely insane. And please, if anybody else in the audience feels this, we'll start a support group. But if one more person sends me information about learning styles, sits me in a presentation about learning styles, tells me how I learn better through kinesthetic learning, I am going to scream. This is something, right, that was part of my PGC. And it was taught to me as this is exactly the sort of thing that you need to be using and thinking about. And I think it may have been a year or two later, it was immediately debunked by a research. But still, in the last school I worked at, so 2 years ago, the last school I worked at, we had a presentation on learning styles. And I sat there smiling and nodding and thinking to myself, why are they talking about such nonsense over and over again? And I
There's
think the
your
main
first
reason,
problem. You're
well,
smiling and nodding, right? At these inset sessions in my schools, there were always teachers at the back that had arms folded and like that look on their face that says, you don't know what you're talking about and I'm not doing it anyway.
yeah, well, I appreciate those teachers. Those teachers, they're some of my favorite curmudgeons in the world, because I think when I started teaching, I was sat at my first CPT session, taking notes like a proper nerd, like, yeah, this is really cool stuff. And the guy next to me was like, third time this has been round. And I was like, okay, fine. Like these initiatives and these agendas rotate. But I'm not the sort of person that wants to give that bad energy with my body language. I'd rather like push back with facts, and maybe that's to my detriment. But like afterwards, I sort of take the person aside and say, "Hey, I'm not sure if you're aware, but this stuff was debunked 20 years ago. Like, what was it, 2008, 2009? It's probably quite damaging that you're still doing this." I'll be honest, that didn't go down well. The person probably didn't talk to me for the rest of the year, but we have to see these things there. People are like, what are you doing to differentiate for this kinesthetic learner? And I'm like, nothing, because a lot of nonsense. It is proved to be a lot of nonsense, and I am not going to dance around just because you've got it on your checklist with the lesson observation. Thank you very much. And I think a lot of the problem is that learning styles in particular, I think, is indicative of feelings over facts. And I think almost intuitively, you know that you have a preference for how to learn, don't you? You have a preference for, maybe you like to watch YouTube videos, maybe you learn by doing, maybe you're the sort of person that likes to read a bunch of stuff and synthesize it down before you go and give something a go. We all have a preference for this kind of things, but that's what it is. It's a preference. The research suggests that it makes no difference what you say your preference is. Things like dual coding work regardless of your preference styles, and the research on that is much more solid than I prefer to read in a corner on my own. Hey, if this stuff was real, my learning style would be in bed on my own. Thank you very much. Leave me alone and give me a cup of tea. That's not in the guidance. Preferences and feelings are not facts. And we need to be really, really careful in education that we validate our feelings, because sometimes those feelings, those intuitions, those thoughts are experiential, and they are things you've built up through seeing behaviors over a period of time. But there are so many variables that might mean that's not a fact. It might not be the thing that you're pushing is the reason that you're getting the results. And we've all had teachers, we've all met colleagues who say, I do this, this, and this, and it always works. And then a training teacher will give it a go and it won't work for them. Why? Because they don't have the cachet and the relationship with the students that this person that's been in the school for 30 years has. So it's not necessarily the factor they think is important that is important. And so, Dave, I'd love to hear your thoughts, but please save me from this world of being told about learning styles 20 years after debunking.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. A lot to unpack there, right? And I want to come back to it. I'm not going to start with this, but I want to come back to flipped classroom, which I know I talk about a lot and I adopt, and it's got critics. And what you're saying is, look, what does the research actually say? Does this thing actually work, right? So I want to come back to that. I'm going to put that on ice for a second, but let's get into the weeds a little bit of the learning styles, because there'll be people out there maybe that don't know what we're really talking about. So we'll kind of unpack that. And you also mentioned dual coding, which is this idea that you can combine pictures and words together. So whereas you might have thought of visual learners just learning from pictures, and auditory learners just learning from sound. Well, what if you join the two things together, right? Not necessarily rocket science, that you might learn better in that way. So let me just sort of break this down. I've got I've got some archives here. Let me go through my archives here and
pull it up from Wikipedia while it's still legal for us.
Wikipedia, what a great source. So, but right, I've got archives because, like you, I've been through training on learning styles, right? And like you, I would look at the people that were sat at the back of the room with their arms folded and weren't going to take it in, because they've seen these things come and go at least twice already, and they know they don't really work. But I have been that teacher that has kind of just lapped it up and thought, yeah, this is it, and I've got to implement this in some way. And it's not that I've become old and cynical. What's happened is I've definitely become old, but I have become reflective. And I've thought, right, well, why is this person saying the thing that they're saying? What is their evidence backup? What position are they coming from? How does that look and feel in my classroom? Have I seen it elsewhere? What do other people think about it? So I've got a much richer body of thought, if you like, to call upon that maybe new and young teachers don't have. And the other thing that you mentioned before I get into learning styles specifically is that you felt that it probably didn't help your career. And this is another important thing to say, is that you can be right, but that doesn't get you promotion. Mm-hmm. And so often, and this is probably a whole new episode, but often in my career, I have been presented with a crossroads. Do I do what I think is right by the students, or do I do what I'm being told? And if I do what I'm being told, I will probably get a promotion down the line because I'm a yes man. or do I do what I think is right for the students, which will give them the best learning experience and allow me to sleep at night, but I won't win any friends or favors by doing it? I think that's a whole different episode, which would be really interesting to explore. But you're right. Those of you that are watching this thinking, oh yeah, I'll just go with Craig and Dave, just be careful, right? We can say what we say because we have been teaching for 20 years. We've gone as far as we want in teaching in terms of promotion. And now the shackles are off. We can say what we like, right? So just a word of caution. Anyway, I digress. Let's have a look at learning styles. So I've got my archives here, right? So the concept of learning styles, I'm just going to read this to you, Kat, if that's okay. So the concept of learning styles, the idea that individuals learn better when they're taught in a preferred sensory modality, okay? Visual, auditory, kinesthetic. Interesting. So where did it come from? Origins. So early theories. The idea of learning styles can be traced back to educational psychology of the 20th century. One of the most influential models was VARK. You'll remember this: visual, auditory, reading, writing, kinesthetic. Okay, VARK.
Oh, it's making my blood boil just hearing it, but carry on.
Oh, there's more goodness. Hang on, there's more goodness. Developed by Neil Fleming in the 1990s, okay, which is why it was a sort of a big thing for us in our careers. Okay, what was its appeal? Well, it resonated with educators and learners because it emphasized personalization and it seemed intuitive. People often feel like they have a preferred way of learning, but do you know what? They don't really. And this seems so obvious now, doesn't it? That we learn by seeing because we've got eyes. We learn by hearing because we've got ears. We learn by touch because we've got fingers. And we learn through smell because we've got a nose. I mean, we need all these senses, right? And then we've got this sort of sixth sense, this intuition, that thing that teachers have got where they know what's going on, even though they're not looking at it directly, right? In the classroom, especially. They kind of get an intuition of what students are doing or thinking at any one moment that you have to build up over a period of time through experience. But that kind of sixth sense that we also have in teaching, and everybody else has got it as well. They just don't necessarily apply it in their line of work.
Yeah, I think a lot of it's like just body language, behavior modeling, experience. It's just a combination of skills, really.
Yeah, absolutely. So the scientific research and the debunking. So the central claim is that matching teaching styles to a student's preferred learning style improves learning outcomes. And that was known as the meshing hypothesis. So you mesh the learning to the learning style. So in other words, we were encouraged, I don't know about you, we were encouraged to create kinesthetic activities.
Yeah, in computer science.
What? In computer science, yeah.
Well, like, let's run the room and then type for 20 minutes. What does that even mean? It's an absolute nonsense. Sorry. Get back off my high horse.
No, absolutely. You know, we were encouraged to have, auditory experiences. And the whole idea was that these different experiences would resonate with different learners in the classroom. So they all end up learning because the kinesthetic learners were able to do it through a kinesthetic activity, and the auditory learners were able to do it through listening to you talk as a teacher. And that, you know, it kind of assumes there that you're just going to do one type of teaching. I don't think I've ever been in a classroom where there hasn't been a mix of things, right? I mean, maybe back in the early days of teaching before my time, students would sit facing the front and they would literally listen to their teacher for an hour and nothing else would happen. In fact, childhood memories, I do remember, I don't know what your experiences were, but I come from a time before whiteboards. So we had a blackboard and chalk, but we had the revolution of the blackboard, because it wasn't a single blackboard. It was on rollers. So there were like 5 blackboards all together, right? And so the teacher would hide away the thing that they wanted us to write down. They would talk, they'd scroll this thing down, and suddenly there's a wall of text, and they'd say, write that down. And you had to do it pretty quickly because you knew in about 5 minutes time that roll was going to disappear up, and a new one where you had to write everything down was presented. And maybe it comes out of that. I don't know, that there's sort of a recognition that, well, that might suit a particular type of learner that wants to read and write, but it doesn't suit the learner that is going to be doing. But in classrooms today, there's a whole mixture of activities, and students learn through all these different methodologies.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I wanted to come back to the point about career, because I mean, look, I'm not a rule follower. I was called, like, insultingly behind my back in lots of schools. Oh, they're going rogue again. They're going rogue. Like, because I was just doing my own thing and what I thought was best based on the data in front of me and not following necessarily what I was told to do. And it did lead me to fall out with a number of people. So maybe I'm not the ideal person, but I do, like, I really believe in evidence-based work. And I think the learning style does come out of some research that was thought to be right at the time, but was debunked very, very quickly. My concern is not really with people trying to do the best practice and taking a notice of research and going, hey, I'm going to try that out in my classroom and see what the impact is like. And I'm going to keep doing it because the research says it's good. Mine is more the fact that when the research debunks it, or when you feel that maybe this isn't working for my scenario, this isn't working for my students, this isn't working for my classroom layout, you need to be critical of what's happening in your room. The only person in a classroom that can influence how the lesson goes is the teacher. And it's the same with behavior. If a student's misbehaving, the only person that can change that outcome is you as the adult in the room, and how you react to the situation. That student isn't going to just magically change overnight. So you need to be aware, and you need to be critically evaluating. And I'm not sure about you, but my PGCE was 90% writing evaluations of what I did in my lessons, and internalizing that and trying to make sure I do that on a regular basis meant that I also did it to everything else. I think that's what may be a little bit unpopular, maybe, because I'd say, well, this is a nonsense, isn't it? Why are we doing this? That's clearly not working. And as an aside, I remember having quite a fraught conversation with a deputy head once, who was a PE teacher, who had decided that the new thing he'd read about was teaching from first principles. And to illustrate this, we had a lesson in the PE room on an inset day where he taught us how to dribble a basketball from first principles. And after an hour, I said, that's great, but we didn't come to the idea that there were 8 bits in a byte because it's some naturally occurring phenomenon that you discover. We decided that and just stuck with it. So no student is going to be able to go, here's a light bulb, please do 100 years of research and come to the same conclusions as the rest of the human race. Enjoy. So, like, sometimes you can feel that this is nonsense and you can apply things to it. But I think one of the big issues is that teachers aren't taught how to evaluate the research. We aren't taught as part of any of our practice how to do that. And even if you do have a research module as part of your PGC, not even mentioning your masters, if you go and do that, then when do you actually get time for it? We don't get allocated time for the research. It's part of, I think it is, I haven't looked in a while, but the last time I looked, it was part of a bunch of teaching criteria and a bunch of Ofsted inspection criteria that we're doing research-based pedagogy. How do we do that if we don't have time? What do we do? Just wait for SLT to turn up on the first day and go, hey, we're doing Teach Like a Champion now? Yeah, because that ain't research back there. That's a load of nonsense, but I'll leave that for another time because that could be another video. But anything that is introduced without a solid research-backed foundation, and anything that a teacher tries to do in their classroom that they can't adequately critique, is destined for failure. And you might have a lot of success for it. But the reason you might have a lot of success with, say, learning styles is probably for a very different reason. It is probably because you are mixing it up and you've decided, well, I can't differentiate the lesson 6 different ways for 6 different learning styles. I'll do a bit of everything. And accidentally, you've hit dual coding. And maybe you're having to come back to it because it's so much. And accidentally, you've hit spaced repetition. And there are so many things in research that fundamentally work really, really well, but they're blooming boring. Spaced repetition, right? It's really boring. It's like teaching something, wait a bit, talk about it again. Like, yeah, that's boring. How do you build that into your syllabus? Well, you can do it with planning, but that's not a sexy observed lesson, is it? That's not, hey, come into my room, deputy head, see me talk about something I talked about 6 weeks ago. That's not, how is that going to get you the outstanding that you want to get on your lesson observation? It's not. And so the entire setup of the teaching profession is such that we're meant to do research. We're meant to use research-informed practice, but we're not taught how to critique research. We're not taught where to find research. We're not given time to read the research, and we're certainly not given access to educational journals to be able to take the cutting-edge stuff and try and apply it to our classrooms.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about that, and I think you're right when you say, look, it is acceptable to take risks, and it is acceptable to not completely dismiss what you're being told by a more senior colleague, but to give it a go, evaluate it for yourself, try something a little bit different, see where it takes you. So we're not saying play safe. We're saying take risks, try new ideas, and see what happens, right? Of course. Yeah. And you said that, for example, that it's been debunked. Perhaps we should sort of close the loop on that. And who it was in the end was a comprehensive review in 2008 by Pashler et al. In the Psychology of Science in the Public Interest, and they concluded that there's no adequate evidence base to justify incorporating learning style into general educational practice. And so there we go. It says people may have preferences, but teaching to those preferences does not improve learning. And something else that you touched on there was this idea of maybe that it has an impact in your classroom and not in other classrooms. I just want to explore that a little bit further as well. I mean, firstly, the subjects are very different, and we come from a computer science background, and inevitably the new initiatives are always presented from the lens of another subject. You know, inevitably it's, this is what we do in English, this is what we do in maths, this is what we do in PE, this is what we do in DT, whatever. It's hardly ever, and I would go so far as to say almost never, this is from the lens of computer science. And so what you have to do is take that initiative and think, how does this apply to my subject? And sometimes I feel like we're forcing it. We force it to fit because we're told it has to be done, and it has to be done in a particular way. And we're not doing it with a reflective mindset of, okay, well, what's really behind this? What are they really kind of trying to get to here? And how can we then adapt that? And then, as you say, reflect on it and see what difference it can make. And quite often, it's not that the whole thing's wrong, but it's just not suitable for that particular subject pedagogy, and it needs adapting in order to make it work. I said I was going to come back to flipped classroom because I think this is a good example of what we're talking about. So people know I'm an advocate of the flipped classroom in computer science, but the first thing I would say is it works for me. It doesn't necessarily mean it works for you. And that's because of everything that you said earlier, Kat, about the fact that I've got a whole wealth of experience behind me and a personality that I deliver, that I bring to the classroom, and all sorts of other things, right, that aren't tangible, really. It's hard to put your finger on it. But also it works in my subject because it's a very technical subject. There are facts, there are things to know. And if you know those things, then you can gain some understanding of something else. And with that understanding, you can gain wisdom of the domain. But ultimately, what we really need is that baseline level of core knowledge and facts. And that works for our subject, which is why Flipped Classroom works in my subject. But it doesn't necessarily work for all teachers because of the way that they approach the classroom and in all subjects. But talking about the research specifically, there is no real research that says flipped classroom doesn't work or flipped classroom really does work. There is research out there. I'm not saying there isn't any research, but the problem is the jury's out, because some of the academic articles claim that it does work and some of the academic articles claim that it doesn't work. So what do I do with that, and why am I an advocate of flipped classroom in my subject? Well, the reason is simple. I didn't approach this because I wanted to adopt the latest academic research. I adopted it because I identified there were two problems in my classroom and I needed to solve them. The first was there wasn't enough time. I didn't have enough lessons. And so when the new A-level specifications, they're not new anymore, they're 10 years old, but when they dropped, I looked at the content, I looked at the number of lessons that I'd been allocated, and I thought, I do not have time to deliver this. So I either stand at the front and impart knowledge for 45 minutes just to get through it, or I find another way of delivering the teacher content that means in the lesson I can go deeper. That was the thinking there. And the second problem was that my students were telling me that they were a bit bored, if I'm honest, and they wanted to do more things in the classroom. So with the problem of not having enough time and the students wanting to be more active, what was going to fix the problem? And that's where I went looking for things that were likely to fix the problem. And I came across the flipped classroom and I realized, aha, this is how you accelerate the learning and you solve both of those problems. So people that say, oh, flipped classroom is no good because it doesn't raise attainment, the outcomes are just the same as not flipping the classroom. Good, fine, I'm happy with that, because the two problems that I set out to solve, I've solved. My students are more active and I've managed to get through the entire curriculum so they go into exams with the body of knowledge they need. If attainment stays the same, it's a winner. It doesn't really matter in that sense. And so,
and Dave, I think you've hit on a perfect point here, because in the real practical classroom, we can't run controlled experiments. We can't say, I'm going to do a flipped classroom with this class, and here's my identical control group that I will not use the flipped classroom in. And in 2 years, let's see the difference in attainment. We maintained, we didn't, there's no way morally we can do that. And I think that's really important for the way that research informed practice works, because sometimes you've got to take something and try it out, and if it works for you, it works. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to massively improve pass rates for everyone. In this case, I think it's fair to say you managed to survive delivering a huge syllabus and make sure the students were engaged and happier in the classroom and maintain your results. Win, win, win. But I think there's systemic change we need to do to allow this to happen, really. You explored flipped classroom because of a necessity. Now, most of the time, the necessity in teaching tends to be behavior, or tends to be class numbers, or something really sort of, it doesn't feel like proper pedagogy, because we're reacting to emotional situations and stuff like that, which is fair, but that's what most of teaching really is. The bit where we consider ourselves subject experts is a small subset of being behavioral experts and relationships experts, and being able to form good bonding relationships with students that are productive for work. But I think as a profession, we need to spend more time on research methodology at training and during our profession. We need to have protected time for research and engagement that isn't taken up by, oh, I've got this student in because they're not behaving and they've been partner classed. We need to have an open way of summarizing research, and publications like Teach Computing are great for that, because they tend to synthesize down the research and the practice in the classroom for what's worked for practitioners in our field. And then you've got that really domain specific usage that's really good and gives you an idea to go and try something. And I think finally, career progression shouldn't just be tied to, am I holding the line? Am I teaching like a champion, like everyone says, or am I teaching like a research-based practitioner, which is really where people should be? And as part of that, observational criteria should be more about the effectiveness of the approach in the lesson, and not necessarily ticking some boxes with the whole school approach this time. And I think that's how we need to push the industry forward.
Yeah, and experience is really important. This I've got a bee in my bonnet now, right? The thing that really frustrates me, I feel like, because I've been doing it for 10 years, and it was not perfect, it was far from perfect in the early days when I delivered flipped classroom. I had all the issues that other people have with flipped classroom, but I knew I was on to something for solving my problems, and so I persevered with it. I worked with it. I found alternative solutions. I mean, for example, one issue was that students weren't really sort of writing notes, that I hadn't taught them how to write notes. Well, the fix for that was, on my video give them the notes that they actually have to record, so I know they've got the facts. But then crucially, it was another teacher that said to me, yeah, but if you now put the Cornell method on top of that, they're not just copying the notes that you've given them because that's what you want them to record because it's useful for the activities in the classroom. Now they're turning those notes into questions, and they're identifying 8 subject-specific terms in those notes that they should be able to then give a definition for. And that completely changed the way my students were then watching the videos and making notes. So it wasn't that it didn't work, it's that it needed refinement. And so that period of 10 years has given me an awful lot of experience where I feel like I'm a bit of a flipped classroom expert now. So if another teacher suddenly picks up resources and tries to deliver flipped classroom and it goes horribly wrong because the students A, don't watch the videos, B, they don't have the notes, C, the teacher doesn't know what they're supposed to do in the classroom, so they just put their feet up expecting not to do any teaching. Do you know what? It fails. Of course it fails.
Of course it does. And I think what you're saying is absolutely right, because we have been, and I'm sure you're part of it as well. Like, I used to be heavy into ITT and helping out trainee teachers, but what they sometimes want from you is, "Oh, give me your resources." And I'm like, my resources ain't going to work for you, dude. My resources are based on me knowing a lot, liking talking, having good relationships, maintaining order in my classroom through those good relationships. And so my resources ain't going to work for you because they're going to take one look at you as a newbie in the classroom and eat you alive if you try to teach from my stuff. You've got to find a way that works for you as you set yourself up with the relationships in this classroom. And I think flipped classroom is one of those things where, yeah, you can take all the Craig a Day videos, you can take all the resources, but if you haven't worked out yet what you're going to do in the lesson time and you try to repeat it, well, the students will go, well, I'm not watching that beforehand then, because you'll just talk about it again in the lesson. And there's so much that can go wrong if you don't implement things properly and thoughtfully. And I think, like, we should be encouraging each other to try these things and to iterate on it and to discuss what's working well and what's not. And I can decide for myself whether flipped classroom is something that can help me, something I want to try and implement. And I can take advice from you. But wholesale taking the resources of a different teacher and just going, boosh, there we go, let me try and do that, is inevitably not going to work the first time you try it, because you are a variable in the experiment.
I think this is one of the things that people just don't really appreciate with our resources and with other resource providers as well. Our resources work. They work for me. They are proven. But unless you invest time in thinking about how you're going to use them and how you're going to deliver them, as you've just outlined, Kat, then it's probably not going to work. I think the misconception is people can buy a set of resources off the shelf and just put them in front of students with very little thought, and it's just going to work. In the same way that I've changed homework now so that students watch a video, and people think that that must be a magic bullet for students doing their homework. No, students still won't do their homework unless you give them a reason to do their homework or you impose sanctions on them for not doing their homework. Just because they've got a video doesn't suddenly make them do homework. And with these resources, you can't just take them off the shelf and put them in front of students. You've got to invest in them and think about, how are these supposed to be delivered? Why are they supposed to be delivered in that way? And how can I adapt them and use them to suit my delivery style in the classroom? I think that's really critical.
Absolutely. And I think there's almost like sorry, I know I've mentioned the book a few times. I won't go on about it again, but there's a certain niceness as a member of SLT, because I've been in that role. I think you've been in that role before. There's something attractive about, hey, here's an amount of money to spend, and you get this set of resources that will solve all your problems. And oftentimes we are bought into that because we're realists as well, and we say, well, it might not solve all of them, but consistency, we've got the basis there, we can work from there. But I think the reality is, a lot of the times, that those things are sold on stories and feelings, and not on research-backed pedagogy. And I think it's really important that even at the level of high-level senior leadership decisions, that we are not buying into things because it's the easy route, we are buying into things because there is proven evidence that things work, and that we allow our teachers to be flexible in how they implement that. Then maybe we have a small core of things that we want everyone to do, but the wider rollout is based on individual teachers' preferences, teaching style, their relationship with the students, what they feel comfortable with, etc., etc., etc. Because certainly I've never felt more compromised in my life than when I was forced to do whole school teaching and learning and behavior management in the one way, the way that seemed they thought would work for everyone. And it's just not my style of classroom management. And I felt really compromised trying to do something that I wasn't comfortable with all day, every day, whilst trying to juggle the needs of the students as well. But I think it's really important that individuality and creativity is allowed to thrive when we are looking at our research-backed decisions when we're implementing whole school policies.
Yeah, so the message really is, when you get new initiatives, we're not telling you just to completely ignore them. What we're saying is, give them a go, evaluate them, think a little bit about why and how are we supposed to be delivering things in this way. So, Kat, brilliant. Thank you so much for joining me again today. And until next time, I'll see you at the chalk face.